today, Security Ratings and Third-Party Risk, What are the Use Cases? Featuring Forrester Research's Renee Murphy. Renee is a principal analyst at Forrester and specializes in security and risk. You're also joined by Prevalence Vice President of Third-Party Risk, Brenda Ferraro. My name is Peter Schumacher, your webinar host today. I've got just a couple housekeeping items to cover before we get started. First of all, a reminder that all attendee lines are muted, but in an effort to keep this session interactive, we invite you to submit your questions via the Zoom console, and then time permitting, at the end of the hour, we'll host a live Q&A. Today's webinar is being recorded, and in the next business day or so, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to that recording. So I know you didn't join to hear my voice, so at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Renee and Brenda. Thanks so much for joining today, and please take it away.
Well, hi, my name's Renee Murphy, Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. Brenda, I'm so happy to be here with you.
I'm excited to be with you as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so let's kick it off. And I want to kick it off by starting on the next slide talking about someone who I think actually is a third-party risk management genius, and that's David Lee Roth. Brenda, I mean, it sounds crazy, right? But I think being the brain trust of Van Halen, that's not a really high watermark. Like that's not a high bridge to cross. But here's the thing. Back in the day, and I'm not going to say I remember this personally, but back in the day, it was odd for rock bands to tour arenas. Like they were the first big band to do an arena tour. And the thing was, they're the first ones to bring a stage like that much lighting equipment, that much rigging so Diamond Dave could fly across the stage. I mean, this was getting ready for the big glam bands, the 80s, who we got used to doing that, right? But David decided he didn't want to he was dealing with promoters who were closer to boxing promoters than they were music promoters. And because that's where they had at the arenas were boxing matches and things like that. So those are the people he was dealing with. And he decided his best third-party risk management was his contract. So the actual contract was about 25 pages, but he said the rider was like 700 pages. He said it was stupid. It was the size of a phone book. But he said right in the middle of it, in the middle of all the required electrical stuff, like daisy chaining light stuff, was no brown M&Ms backstage. And there were consequences for having brown M&Ms backstage. One of the consequences was the promoter forfeited all their money. So there's no more money to be made from David Lee Roth showing up. The band kept it all. And two, the band was required to trash the dressing room. So remember, back in the 80s, like they had this reputation for being wild and crazy. And yeah, Eddie did love trashing the dressing room, but it was contractual obligation. It wasn't sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was contractual obligation at that point that they had to trash the dressing room. And what the brown M&Ms were about were key controls. He had a visual key control. If he saw brown M&Ms, there's a pretty good chance you didn't read any of that rider. And if you didn't read any of that rider, him and the band were going to be in jeopardy, right? Like, and I don't know if you've ever seen a lead singer go down like on the first hit, touching something equipment while standing in water, but it's terrifying, right? They have a lot to worry about on stage. And honestly, like being killed by your own, lighting system is one of them. So, that is why David Lee Roth will continue to be, I hope I get to meet him someday. He will continue to be my third-party risk management genius. He's my hero at this stuff. So Brenda, I mean, that's it, right? That's what it's all about. There's complex environments, there's tons of obligations, there's all these things we have to worry about when dealing with third parties. We're not going to know until something goes wrong. All we have are key controls. I'm not too off on that, right? Dave was onto something.
He totally was. And what's funny is he set the stage, and the pun is intended, because then Mariah Carey needed 2 bouquets of white roses. Kanye West needed a barber chair. So it's kind of interesting how he set the stage for risk governance. And what's interesting is that you can have these questionnaires that you fill out, and you have key controls that you look at, but what is the maturity level of them? You can have continuous threat monitoring, and exactly what is that telling you? So understanding exactly what you're looking into to identify risk is brilliant in the aspect of, if you put something in there that you make sure that they're doing what you're asking them to do, then it helps you to have a no-flaw system.
Exactly. And to think it came from Diamond Dave, right? And I think, and you're right, it goes on to be like, that's how we work now. Even today, you'll put a couple of things, a couple of pretty good metrics into your contract to make sure that you have some way to kind of get on the other side of that should something bad happen, right? I mean, again, he's my genius. We can move on to the next slide, but I could talk about Dave all day long because I love this, right? I just love it. But here's the thing. Everybody brings us third-party risk. Everybody's a third party to the risk of the organization. And I mean everybody, employees, shareholders, regulators, everybody is a risk, right? And so for me, it's this idea that if the third-party, risk exists everywhere, then third-party security risk exists everywhere. And I can't tell you, Brenda, how many times. So I take about 80 calls a quarter if I'm not traveling a lot. Like that's a lot of calls in a quarter. But in that time, I'll talk to maybe 3 or 4 people who are coming to the market, Fortune 50 companies who are coming to me to say, I think it's probably about time we started looking at security in the supply chain. And you're just like, oh, huh? What have you been looking at all this time? I mean, that's literally what comes out of my mouth. Like, what have we been looking at? This? And they'll say, we were looking at financial and credit risk. We need them to be able to pay bills and take money. And we're like, no, that's the least of what you need them to be able to do, right? Like, so has that been your, like your introduction to the market? Because you guys obviously are coming into a market need for monitoring, right? So like my thing is people don't even know they need it yet. Like that's what's strange to me. And I'm not talking Fortune 1,500. I'm talking Fortune 50 that are still coming to me saying, maybe we want to add cyber to our monitoring capabilities. That is, to me, still stunning.
Yeah, it's interesting because I will be talking to companies of every size, and they really don't exactly know why they're doing what they're doing. In some cases, they might be driven by compliance, regulatory requirements. They might be driven by a breach that's happened and it's implemented the need for them to go ahead and be copacetic on their own portion. And then there's also the insider threats that they may be introduced to, and then risk. Some of the companies are driven by risk, and some are driven by multiple things at the same time. But if you don't really know why you're doing what you're doing, you'll find that you're looking at the wrong components to identify and reduce risk.
That's a really good point. So if we go on to the next slide, I think that's a really good point. So which of the following IT governance initiatives have you implemented or you are implementing with your suppliers over the next 12 months? If you look at this, 62% say they want to negotiate lower rates with their current players. I think that's what's interesting, right? So if the program still exists just to get lower rates, and we're throwing out all of the things that lead us to better relationships while getting those lower rates. And maybe the cheapest, I mean, did we learn nothing from the shuttle disaster? Maybe we shouldn't buy the cheapest O-rings on the market. Like, did we learn nothing from that, right? So for me, that we still look at, IT services, initiatives for third-party risk management are being put in place in order to negotiate lower rates, make more selective sourcing or out-tasking approach, move from a time and materials to a fixed price pricing model, right? Like it's all of that stuff. I want it to be, we'd like to take a more holistic approach and we want to ensure security in our supply chain. And I think that's where we probably have to be. If we go on to the next slide. And is that where they're at still, Brenda? I mean, is that where the fight is? Is security monitoring
as you're going into
nice
the next slide before we get into that, you were really close to point on better rates. But what I'm finding in the industries is that what they're doing is their threat landscape is so broad. They have multiple vendors, entities, suppliers that are doing the same type of work. And some of them are more secure in their security, physical, and cyberspace. And then some of them not so much. And we all want to try to get to the point where we're helping the ecosystem mature together. So we help those vendors by saying, hey, here's a risk. You need to mitigate it within this amount of time. But at the same time, we need to also say if we have 25 third parties that are doing the same thing and 5 of those are doing very well in their security space, then we need to go back to them from a contractual perspective and reduce the rates, have a bake-off. And it will get the prices down, of course, but then we'll also be in the positive with regards to the more secure companies. And then there's concentration risk. So what if we have one vendor or third party that's doing all the work and there's no backup? So that's the other side of the coin.
And before everybody thinks that that's something that can't happen, look at Takata, right? Takata was the airbag company that I can't understand how the entire world didn't understand. They had systemic risk in the fact that they all bought from the same manufacturer, and the manufacturer was determining the steering column, not the other way around. So GM didn't design a steering column that worked really well and then went to somebody and said, create an airbag. They had to create the steering column to accommodate a Takata airbag. And there were how many companies, like 15, 16 of just the US car companies, people who sold in the US market. It's the largest recall ever. Like the Japanese government propped them up in order to make enough airbags to get the recall done, and now they don't exist anymore. $400 million company gone over that, right? Gone over one airbag problem that killed 14 people in the US. I think that's what's interesting to me about that, right? So before you think like that's not something that can happen, absolutely it's something that can happen. It happened to the entire automotive industry. I still, knock on wood, I still haven't had to take, my car has to go in, but nothing bad has happened to it yet. But, I have one that has to go in to have the Takata airbag taken out of it because it can kill me in a low speed crash, right? I mean, that's really terrible. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point. You got to build risk into the supply chain analysis. Otherwise you end up with this stuff. And, and don't tell me systemic risk doesn't exist. A whole industry was using the same manufacturer for one thing. That's systemic risk. What are the odds it's going to go down? I don't know, but it did. So maybe it's 100%, right? So that's kind of where
right.
I'm at with it. So which of the following are your firm's biggest challenge with your existing IT services and outsourcing relationships? Cost savings are lower than expected. I think everybody thinks they're going to outsource and things are going to get cheaper. They almost never do. Inconsistent or poor service quality or delivery. I blame half of that on us, right? When I give something over to the third party, it's my job to set the expectation. I mean, we teach people how to treat us, right? Isn't that what Dr. Phil always says? And so if that's the case, then you teach the third party that you don't care what they do. You're not holding them to any requirements. You don't do any due diligence. Why would they pay any attention to you or give you good service or, make sure you're well taken care of? You've clearly, made it clear to them that they don't care, right? So part of me feels like, all of this is they don't invest enough time or people in the relationship. Like, yeah, this is all the challenges, but let's face it. If there are, let's call it out, like maybe we can figure out we have 10 critical vendors that house 90% of what we do in a day. Those are the 10 we want that really good relationship with. Everybody else is going to be held to some version of that relationship. And then there's going to be a whole tier on the bottom that give us coffee and toilet paper. And while those things are too important, they're at the lower end where we say, if you don't deliver on the contract on time, we'll just find someone else to bring us toilet paper, right? I mean, that's how that works. So really, I'm asking you to maintain a very close, well-framed and well-developed relationship for just 10% of that total vendor population. Do you see right now, Brenda, are they mature enough to deal with that? Because I think if they're mature enough to deal with that, I know who you are, I know what you do for me, and I know how important that is. So I'm going to put you under a certain level of scrutiny. I might even monitor you in real time from now until the end of that contract just to know what's going on. I think that that's a legitimate thing for somebody who is that important to the organization. But are there enough people out there who are that mature to say, forget regulatory compliance, this is the right way to run the organization from a risk perspective?
Yeah, I think they're starting to look more at an enterprise risk approach, because it used to be just the third-party risk governance organization that was working with just IT. We're now looping in OT. We're looping in business continuity. We're looping in privacy. And so enterprise-wide, we have to understand who are our third parties, and not just our third parties, but who are our end parties? How far does that exposed data go from point A to point Z, and how many hands does it touch as it crosses through the servicing? If it's outsourced, if it's onshore, if it's offshore, is it data that's sensitive or critical? And the key performance indicators and risk indicators of the platform and the solution that you use has to be able to show you a spider diagram of what departments are using that data. Where is that data going in case there's a breach? If it's enterprise-wide, if you're collecting information to do the proper due diligence of risk, can you share that content that you collect through the platform such as Prevalent to say, for each of these departments, This is the content you need to know, and these are the areas that you need to see in order to make those risk decisions. So I agree with you, but I think that we're kind of limping along. Right now, we've got to the point where we've done collection. We're starting to see all of the companies in every industry start to look at risk and mitigating those risks. And then finally, we have to be able to see what is the landscape and the platform that's going to provide us exactly what risk indicators we need to know and performance indicators to make those decisions.
I think that's a really good point. If we go on to the next slide, we can say, I think current maturity, this is, here we're talking about here, which of the following goals are part of your firm's compliance, governance, and mandate strategy? Now the reason I included this is because it's from 2012. Lower cost, gain favorable terms and conditions, do a better job of controlling or lowering our supplier risk. Whoa, right? So even back in 2012, we were talking about lowering supplier risk, and it was in the third. What have we done about that, right? I would say from 2012 until now, not a whole lot. I talk a lot about it. I get yelled at a lot about it. Everybody's coming to me saying, what's your solution for this, right? I've even gotten yelled at by my favorite people on earth, the Forrester Leadership Board, a bunch of chief information security officers. I'll never forget it. They just sat down and said, we hate you because we hate third-party risk management. That's when I hired another analyst to help with it, because I thought, clearly I'm not doing, and that was like 2 years ago. Clearly I'm not doing enough, right? So I think this is the part I think, and this is why I wanted to include it. We were all proud of ourselves back in 2012. I got to tell you, I've been doing this that long. I feel like we haven't made a whole lot of progress, and I'm looking for the digital transformation of third-party risk management. I feel like this is a use case that is like crying out for, help me manage it somehow. Would you agree?
Yeah, what's interesting is that with the regulators, and rightfully so, they're saying, hey, we need to look at things. But when we look at things, we go to one pendulum side and we start looking at everything that's higher critical risk, forgetting about all of the medium and the low type risk. We really need to be looking at what is the engagement, what is the profile, what are they handling, what are they not handling. We've put so much focus on putting things into buckets that we're not really focusing on what's valid and relevant of risk. So I like how you've highlighted the fact of lowering our supplier risk, doing a better job of controlling that, but we need to make sure that we're doing the control the right way, that we're not just pigeonholing things into certain parameters and really missing the point of all the risks that we need to look at, not just the critical risks.
So we can go on to the next slide, but I just want to close that out by saying, I talk about context all the time, and you're right. We've been putting stuff into buckets for a while now, and we've got big buckets full of stuff, but we don't have any context for what those buckets mean across each other. Like, I don't know what the firewall log data has to tell me in context with the DDoS system, in context with the threat and vulnerability tolerance, in context with what we're delivering from a contractual perspective, and that leads to what our risk tolerance might be for that. I mean, that's how complicated that stuff gets. And I keep telling people, context actually matters. It's the difference between Dorothy being a confused 16-year-old girl who hits her head in Kansas and wakes up and realizes Annie M was at least feeding her, and that's not so bad, right? Or she's a terrorist who drops into a foreign land, kills the first woman she meets, gets radicalized by the local government, and don't tell me she wasn't localized, it wasn't local government, the mayor was there, right? So it's like, you got the mayor there, they send her off on the road where she radicalizes 3 more idiots, they go do drugs, they steal goods and services, they go kill more people, and then they escape, like one of those girls needs, an intervention by a social worker, and the other one needs the National Guard of Oz to take her down. Which one is it? Because only one of, can they both be true? And if they are, do they both require, remediation strategies? I would think so, but in this case, they're not both true. The context is she hit her head and passed out. We don't need to send any National Guards to Oz. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it. That's how the Wizard of Oz works, right? So like that can
Oh my gosh, I need to hang out with you more often because you have made me look at Wizard of Oz a totally different way.
Right? right? It's the really Renee confused way of it. Yes, but it's true, right? I mean, that's what it is. In that context, she's in two separate contexts. But when you see the movie till the end, you understand the right context to be in. It is a different kind of intervention. So then I go and I look at, like we look at the next slide and we say, you know, what is third-party risk management maturity today? I'd say right now we're in between it, like we're at a 2.5 or a 3. Now we've been there for a long time. But here's the thing. Lately, I'm talking to people who are at the 3. Now they say, all right, I have good process. I have the right people. But the business is tired of the manual stuff. There's got to be a way to automate. Whoa, what? Like, if that's where we're at, if we're standing on the cliff, like we've reached the end of the road and now there's a cliff, we're going to take out our parachute, strap it on, and jump. That's how we're going to get down the cliff. If that's the case, then we need tools to get there from here, right? Third-party risk management maturity, you're not going to get any better at this. You're not going to get any faster at this. You're not going to be able to find any context in any of it if you don't leverage software to get it done. So if most of the market is sitting here at a 3 saying, all right, now what? Now what is you're going to mature this to a managed and measurable environment. You're going to do it with software because software is going to turn it around fast enough that you can actually start using it as a competitive advantage in your supply chain. It's competitive because you're going to get better rates. You're going to have built-in security. You're going to have automated ways of reminding those people and taking surveys from them and all of that stuff. All of that stuff is about to become automated for you. So now you can think about supplier strategy instead of supplier compliance, right? So like that's, I think, where most people are. They're standing there at the 3, trying to get to the 4, but trying to do it without spending money. And you know what? More power to you. You got to a 3 without spending a whole lot of money. I know, because I helped you get there. This is the time where you take all that goodwill and say, wouldn't it be awesome if we knew this in real time? Because you could, if only you had software. I mean, is that where you're finding them to be, Brenda? Because I feel like that's where everybody I talk to is. Like, they're like, oh, do you have software now? Like, that's kind of where they're at.
Yeah, so just yesterday I was sitting in a room with some very distinguished financial institution thought leaders that have practitioner skills for third-party risk. And the things that they were talking about was the automation of how do I know that my vendor is communicating back to me after I don't want to do a one and done assessment. I don't want to tell them what they need to mitigate and then forget and let it go away. But also, what are our risk baselines? How do I understand for a particular network, maybe it's financial, maybe it's healthcare, where we can define those risks at a baseline level, and then each company would be able to then go in and put their risk tolerance against that. So I do see that that's where a lot of the organizations are. And you can go and take surveys, and some of the industries will say, I'm much better than the other, but literally they have pros and cons in certain areas. One industry might be very good at the automation of collection of content, but they're not doing risk mitigation as well. And then vice versa, the other one might be doing risk mitigation even better, but they're not collecting the right contextual data. So you're pretty much on point.
Yes, and I feel like that's why we haven't matured. People aren't, you need to go spend the money on this one. This is one that you can't roll into other stuff. It does take its own data sets. It does have its own life. There's a reason why more than one of you own the data. If you're in a big like Fortune 50 company, you're trying to figure out how to work with procurement, right? Like you're just trying to figure out you're going to be if you're IT, how are you going to be in the loop when they're making decisions on what to buy? How do you stay out of being the last person in that line to say no, not the first person in that line to say no, right? Like that's the part where it starts to get really hairy for me. But you know what? There are people who are really, really good at this stuff. And those people who are really good, Nissan's one of them. Nissan's crazy good at third party and supplier risk management. They are my go-to story on that kind of stuff. But for as good as Nissan is, and they are really, really good, there are practices out there that are done by the worst companies in the world. So if we look at those next slide, we'll see, like, if you recognize yourself in any of this, you're among the worst at third-party risk management. You don't have to tell anybody. You don't have to tell me. You can just quietly take that in and go do something about it. But the practices are, spend on information security and IT assurance, 25% of the industry norm. If you're not putting any money into security and compliance is how we prove we're secure. If you're not doing that, you're among the worst, right? So procedures to manage vendor compliance and risk, if you don't have any of that, you're among the worst. Information gathered by vendors, you don't do that at all. Compliance and risk scoring factors, you're not doing that at all. Remediation steps, none. You don't care. You're just working with them, right? Automation levels, you have almost none, 15%, which means you must be using email. And then operational cadences, you're only looking at this once a year during an annual contract renewal, at which time you'll have absolutely no leverage because this is a critical vendor and you really need them. They have all the leverage in the conversation. So these are the practices among the worst of us, right? So if you are standing there saying, well, how do I leapfrog that? I mean, if this is a 1, how do I get to be a 4 too? Well, it starts by putting a program together and then putting software in place to help manage the program so that you can pull metrics out the back end. I mean, I don't see too many people that are this bad that would qualify among the worst, but I do find people, Brenda, who aren't even spending this any amount of money on compliance, or they're not spending any amount of money on security, or security is getting 3% increases in budget annually. Do you know how much money the Russians put into this stuff? As much as we put into the NSA. That's who you're competing against when you give them 2%. Right? Like that's what you're saying. You know what? I think you're 2% worse than the NSA. That's what you're saying. You're only 2% off from the NSA. I'm going to give you that much money. Like, that's crazy, but that's what we're up against, right? So until you take security really seriously in the organization, you're not going to take it really seriously in the third party, and the third parties pose you a way bigger risk than I think anybody in the organization might. Although you can argue with me with that one, but this is the worst. I don't see too much of this. How much of this do you see, Brenda?
So a really funny story, there was a company that did a self-assessment on their program, and they went to the executives and they said, we need funding. We need a platform. We need to automate. We need more resources. We need to do the right thing in order to protect the data. And the executive said, no, we don't have any funding. We're not going to give it to you. So he said, okay. So then they did an internal audit. And the internal audit basically was just the same as the self-assessment of the program. And that individual took it back to the executives and said, look, internal audit says that we need to fix these things. And now that internal audit says that we need to fix them, you need to find the money. And he got the money. So there's techniques that you can use in order to make it, but you have to make sure that you are reporting on the problems within the weaknesses or the vulnerabilities to explain to the board and to explain to the executives, here's what could happen to you. This is what you need to do in order to keep that from occurring. We need to be not only reactive, but we have to be defensive. So those are the proactive and reactive. So those are the things we need to put in place.
So yeah, that is a funny story, because I got to tell you, I've been doing this job for like 7 years, but I'm formerly a network engineer, a VP of data center operations, and both an internal and external IT auditor. And as an internal IT auditor, if you're working with people who know what they're doing, they'll stop you at the door, say, put down your book and your work papers. You can go back to that later. Bring an empty notebook. I got some stuff to show you. And they would walk you around and be like, see how this panel work, right? This is going to kill someone one day, and you're like, oh damn, this is going to kill somebody one day. And then they'll be like, hey, see this is water in a data center, this is bad. I'm like, oh, people are going to get electrocuted. Like, you write it all down. And then I threw out everything I brought. They had bigger fish to fry, and it was all the stuff they couldn't get done. And they're like, Renee, help us. And I'm like, you know what, you're right. This is, anybody would see that this is wrong. I didn't realize the level of tolerance that the organization had for risk, because they didn't care. But that thing, and I called it findings for funding, like, that is a thing. Oh my God, yeah. And it's all F's. It's like an F3. Like, it's F3. Like, it's findings for funding. It just hit me. But yeah, that's what it is. Like, go find that. Go get your money. Like, that's your money. Would you leave money on the table anywhere? No. If you want your money, go work with audit to get it. It's a finding. It's going to need funded. It's their rules. Just go play by their rules, right? I mean, that's how it works. And if you know how to leverage audit, and those kind of people I love to work with, right? Because I do have to come back with a finding, or I haven't justified my existence in this world. And I have to actually do that, in a way that's going to be helpful to you. The only way to do that is for you to tell me, right? So, yeah.
Right, exactly. And it all goes back to what is the bottom line that's going to hit the business when it goes wrong. That's all they care about in the executive ranks, is how much am I going to lose? What is it going to cost me? Am I going to have brand damage? And if you can loop anything back to, I'm saving you money in advance in order to not have that happen in the future, then it's more likely that will happen. But I like your coined F3. I think you should probably make that a patent and get it out there.
There you go. I'm going to trademark TM, F3 TM. There you go. I trademarked it. So we go to the next slide. Where do you start? So, you got to identify all the suppliers, perform a risk assessment to determine their criticality to the organization. Critical vendors are classified and governed as such, meaning that's subject to constant pen testing and all that other stuff, and they have to agree to it. Non-critical vendors can be managed by contract, but again, you're going to assess them halfway through the contract, not on the last day of the contract, halfway through the contract, and you still have leverage. Don't give up the leverage. And don't try to create your own. It doesn't really actually work. And then continual monitoring of critical vendors. That's the part, Brenda, right there. That continual monitoring piece, because what we're going to find out, I don't think it's going to happen in 2021, but by 2022, when your external auditors come to do the audit, how fast you can turn around information to them, like when was the last time you checked out this third party, the faster you turn that information around, the better score you're going to get. And if it turns out that it's going to take you, 2 weeks to get that data together for them, that's going to be an ineffective control, and you're going to be forced to change it. So, we had the PCAOB go back to the Big Four and say, listen, quality of evidence is now a thing, right? It's not okay that we did the digital transformation in the business, and that now the business can do transactions 1 million at a second, right? And compliance is still pulling 175 records manually. It's not going to work anymore. So even the regulators are stepping up to it, right? So, where do you start? This is exactly what you do. But to get to this part where critical vendors are classified and governed as such, that's it. That's the software. Right? Because right after that comes non-critical vendors get bucketed, critical vendors get continual monitored. We're going to pull in data from third parties to get that done. We're going to understand who's on their board of directors. We're going to see what their reputation is about, and we're going to continue to monitor that in as close to real time as we can, so that we can divorce ourselves from things that are going on if they don't have anything to do with us, right? So I think that's all really, really important, that your reputation is tied up in your supply chain as much as their reputation is tied up in yours, right?
Yeah, and I really like this slide. The only thing that I'd probably change is that monitoring of third parties has a connotation or a taxonomy that's not well understood across the universe. A lot of companies are saying that monitoring is, I'm assessing them continuously. Monitoring is third-party threat vendor information, like open source intel. So basically, you should start that at the very beginning. You should also do it in the middle, and you should do it at the end, because the hackers can see that content. Assessments and evaluations are continuously assessing what you get from the onset of a risk, to the inherent risk, to the residual risk, to the closed risk. And that's continuously assessing and evaluating. So I would just kind of put a loop around the whole thing and say that threat monitoring needs to be done in the beginning, the middle, and the end, ongoing. And then you've got the assessment and evaluation that, based on mitigation, will trigger different things that need to happen in order to make sure that you're closing those risks.
Well, and I always say risk is like plutonium. Well, it doesn't make your hair fall out. I think it does, actually. But it's like plutonium, right?
Or it makes you pull it out. One or the other.
It does feel like that some days. But it's like plutonium. Like, it has a half-life. And we can bury it deeper, or we can encase it in concrete. But, I mean, it's still going to be plutonium for a very long time. So as much as we try to mitigate risk, or we try to get rid of it, now we have residual risk, right? And it's going to stay around for as long as we exist. And the more of that residual risk we accept, the more I think the more systemic risk we're probably building. And to understand what that means in the supply chain, and to understand what that means in the value chain, that's actually really important. And I don't disagree with you that the threat monitoring has to happen almost constantly. Yeah, it does. You're right. Perform the risk assessment, yeah, and then do a threat assessment, of course. Why are those two different if they are? Right? I always say, like your biggest problem with me in third-party risk management is just a lack of integrity. Like, that would be the hardest thing for me to take. You send me back a survey that tells me you're all 5s, yet I'm looking at a score somewhere that says you're anything but. Why are you delusional? Is that it, or are you lying to me? Which would you rather be shot for? Right? Like, either way, that's
right.
Not good. Right? So for me,
yeah,
integrity means a lot.
Yeah, it's the trust and verify scenario, of course, because you can't just agree with what people are telling you. You have to check. You have to have evidence. You have to bump that up against the threat intel and open source feeds, and in the future, agents that will be able to tell you if your IT hygiene is appropriate or not. So there's all these different things that are coming down the pipe that's going to make it so that it's much faster and much easier for us to know where the risk and the vulnerabilities lie based on the information that we have at our fingertips.
And it takes a village, right? I mean, we all have to know what everybody else's weaknesses are. You're the weak link in the chain. We just came back from the Security and Risk Conference, and Chase, who does our Zero Trust, he had a slide up, and it was this really heavy chain that was linked together with a zip tie, and I'm like, yep, that's your third party right there, the zip tie, right? Like, doesn't matter how mean that chain looks, it's still your third party is that zip tie, and no matter what, they're going to get in, like, people are going to get in now, like, that's the weakest link, like, that's really ridiculous. But I feel like that's it. Like, you're only as strong as your weakest link, and you allow that weak link in. So, like, that's what your job is, to make those links as strong as they can be, or at least put a junkyard dog in front of the fence too. I mean, that's what you have to do. If you're going to use zip ties, you're going to have to put a big, mean dog in front of it too. I think that would help. But if we can go to the next slide. And I think we're here to talk about implementation strategies. But before we do, I want to talk, like, if you happen to be in one of those companies that has to deal with, procurement, not deal with procurement. Oh, well, this is a fun story, Brenda. We brought a bunch of procurement people together with a bunch of security people, and it became, you're all delusional. Like, they were pointing the finger at each other. Like, you guys don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're asking for. Yes, we do. You don't care. Like, it was that kind of stuff. Like, and it was so funny to hear them yell at each other. And at the end, I just stood up and said, you all want the same thing. Let's figure out how to work together, procurement. Like, I get that you think we're being alarmist and weird, and that you think the money is the most important thing, but how about just, like, just humoring us, just help us help you, right? Like, this is how it should be. And so that's why I ended up putting this implementation strategy together, because you have to think that we don't do security in a vacuum, just like Dorothy didn't visit Oz in a vacuum. We don't do security in a vacuum. It's part of larger processes. So if we're going to leverage those, we should do that. So how many people do you work with where they're adding to their procurement process, by coming to the market? Or are you meeting people who are like, I have no procurement, and, like, I have to start from nothing. I am procurement. How does that split out for you, Deborah? Because for me, it's like
majority. The majority of what I'm seeing is that procurement is being brought to the table if they didn't start it themselves. So interestingly enough, I was at a client, and we invited enterprise risk management. We invited their automation capability, which they were looking at a tool that was going to be like the overall view of everyone's intel. And then we also had procurement in the room. And what was interesting was that the third party organization was really trying to get procurement engaged. And when we had them at the table to talk about what improvements were going to be accomplished within the prevalent solution, they all kind of looked at each other and said, well, wait, why are we just using it for third party risk in IT? We should be using this for our privacy questionnaires. Yep. We should be using this for our procurement intake, for stratification on what are these third parties doing. We should use it to hold contracts. So that's where I'm seeing things go. So it's very minimal at best that I'm seeing that procurement's not involved these days. They're starting to get involved more and more, if not already.
I think that's funny. Maybe they had Stockholm syndrome. Like, they thought they didn't have solutions for them, that there wasn't anything out there that could help them manage. Like, they just had Stockholm syndrome. It was like, I have sympathy for my captors. I'm just going to keep doing it the way I'm doing it. Like that's almost sad. No. Well, at any rate, let's go on to the next slide, because this is how I talk with people who are in some kind of procurement environment, right? So if you want to add security to procurement, this is how you have to do it. You ask, like, if you're procurement today, you want to ask security for the minimum enterprise security requirements. If you're security, you want to supply this to your procurement team. You want to supply them with information about the risks involved with different delivery methods, cloud, on-prem, co-sourcing, stuff like that. You want to help them with RFP and vendor selection, specifically around the security requirements for the RFP. You should have 15 or 20 of those requirements that are specifically related to security. It really shouldn't be any different than that, but you have to tell them what that is, right? They can't come up with this stuff on their own. It's not their job. Their job is to make sure that they meet the minimum requirements. What are your minimum requirements? And for everybody, that's different, right? We can go to the next slide. And then We also do negotiating and contracting. Ensure security and privacy provisions should be part of the contract. Service solution deployment. Make sure security review is part of the project delivery. Did we like the last thing we do before we put it in production is harden it and make sure it's good. Ask security to assess the vendor through updated surveys or audits at least annually. This is security getting involved with whether or not they're worse or better than they were before, or whether they've been responsive. Did they take part in our change management, our incident management, our BCDR? I mean, if they're our cloud provider, they should be doing all of that. We should have them that well integrated, right? And then ask security for feedback on the ongoing compliance of the vendor. So, you know, when you're looking for service solution refinement, make it part of their ability to get back into this company to be a third party, is how good of a grade they get at working with your security people. And that's entirely up to your security people, not to the third party and not to procurement, who really wants this deal. So I think that's when we talk about, like, how do we integrate ourselves into that? Where do we start? What can we do, you know, before we spend money on the program? I mean, this is it. This is a good security program. I think this is what you do when you want to integrate security embedded into the vendor management lifecycle management process. And I think this is what I like about it. How many of your folks, like, that you're talking to are this mature, though, that they're this well? I mean, if always or close to always procurement's in the room and they're ready for this, what have they been doing up until that point? Is this manual for them?
A lot of them are using spreadsheets before they come over to our solution, but I'm also seeing that the annual one and dones are starting to go away. We've got a couple customers that feel they could do assessments or evaluations based on 3 years, 2 years, and 1 year. And that's leaning more towards the continual evaluation and assessment based on risk mitigation, identifying those risks, and then the risks are completed, so it reduces. And then if everyone's using the same type of standard questionnaire and they're using a platform that tells them exactly what's happening across the ecosystem, then it's maturing everyone faster. But yes, I do agree that there are a lot of mature companies that are doing it this way, but they're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel for a more economic approach, and they're leaning towards continuous versus one and dones. Are you on mute, Renee? Did I lose you?
No, I'm here. So, but that goes back to the idea that they're finally maturing into looking at it from a risk perspective rather than a compliance perspective. Because compliance leads you to say, I'll do it once a year. That's what I'm required to do. And, you know, I had a couple of those calls like last quarter where people were like, you're telling me I should do more than what's required. Well, yeah, I am. I'm telling you to manage your risk. I'm telling you compliance isn't going to cut it. If compliance did cut it, the IRS wouldn't be breached all the time. Like, if compliance really worked, there would be no data breaches in the world. It's just not true. Like, compliance is the lowest common denominator. It's not the high water mark. So yeah, you need to do better than compliance, right? And so when they look at what you require me to do, and then you have what someone like me or you is telling them that they're supposed to do, that sometimes looks like a big like cavernous gap to them. But I keep reminding them it's filled with, I don't know, something really fun, you know, like marshmallow cream. I don't know. It's filled with something super fun. Go in it, because it's really what you're meant to do. You're meant to just wallow in that data until you find out what it means and then get out and go fix it, right? Like, that to me is what that's all about. We can go to the next slide, but yeah, for me that...
When you change slides real quick though, one thing I want to bring up is yesterday I asked the room, how many of you in this room have received the proper due diligence, assessed an entity or a third party, and then once they were onboarded, it was a completely different engagement, and they all raised their hands.
Yeah.
So we've got to clean up the fact that we know what we know when we know it, and that kind of constantly changes, and it has to be updated to reflect what we know at the time.
Yeah, I agree. Well, it goes back to context, right? Context is one of the most important things we have, and the context changes constantly. Like, one risk, one identity and access management risk for one group is not the same for another, just based on the kind of access that they have, right? I mean, it's just, that is how this stuff works. But I can move from one group to another and have it all change for me. Of course, that's how everything works. Why would we think identity and access management works that way, but risk management doesn't? Of course it does, right? When it comes to metrics, I mean, we got to know that we're successful. You can't manage what you don't measure. I say it all the time, and I think it's true. We can go on to the next slide, but I usually tell people use a limited amount of survey questions. Oh, and by the way, I love maturity questions rather than binary yes, no. It tells me way more about you, right?
Right.
And it tells me, way more about your maturity level. And there's a ton of them out there. So that's always a good way to look at that. Resubmit the survey to the vendor at least annually. Hook the vendor management process to an existing process. If you have good project management, you have good procurement, you have good contract review, vendor setup in the AP system, hook it to that, right? They already have their own metrics. They already have their own process. Take advantage of something that already works and just build on it. Use deductive reasoning to determine the security posture of the vendor. You're going to have a ton of data, but it still requires critical thinking, you guys. We can't give it up to the machines just yet. And deductive reasoning is not a guess. I wrote a blog post. It was probably it's 7 years ago. I've been here 7 years. So when I first got here, though, I wrote about Hurricane Pam because I kept hearing to everybody that's like, sitting around doing scenario analysis wasn't paying off for anyone. And I just said, you're not committed enough to it. Go read Hurricane Pam. It's the FEMA tabletop exercise that happened 6 months before Katrina. And you'll see that they knew exactly what was going to happen. They just didn't put any money into it. That was it. That's all it came down to. Was they came back and said, we're going to need X amount of dollars to keep what happened in Katrina from happening. And they all said, nope, we're going to put, so much money into the last resort. And that's the end of it. And so that was how it played out. But they knew it would happen. They knew it because FEMA did a study of it. That's what happens when you put people around the table who know what they're doing and ask them to tell you what the outcome is going to be. It's not a guess. It's anything but a guess. And I think that's the most important thing. And the more data you have, the better you get at anything but a guess. So tell me, Brenda, how do you talk to them about that? Because it's really, like, for me, that's what you're getting past. You're getting past the idea that I just gave you a ton of data. That doesn't excuse you from telling a really good story about it, because that's what we need to hear from you.
Right. I think that you're talking really about true risk, because you mentioned a little bit about if it's a bad response, we're reviewing that. If it's a good response, we're accepting it without even digging deep. And so if we don't know the maturity of that yes response, then we don't really know what the risk is, because someone could be saying that they're doing it and they're not, or they could be saying that they're doing it, but it's just at the very onset of a program build. So they're not very mature at it. And I think that with a platform that can give you your key controls, your risk recommendations, your pre-programmed risk ratings, and really flag the items that the machine learning can give to you, you still will need those people to do the proper dispositioning, but it weeds out the really unrisky things versus the riskiest, so that we can work on the things that matter. It's all about context like you talked about before, but it's also about relevance, and it's also about risk tolerance that's different for every company. So I think that as soon as people start using a venue and a way and a channel to get that information served up to them, they're going to change from data collectors and evaluators to risk mitigators. And that's what we need more of.
Right. Oh, I agree. We need more risk mitigators. That's definitely true. We can go to the next slide and talk in more detail about the metrics. There's some things. Technology, it's number of user complaints or percent of purchase spend. Under process, it's percent of major suppliers meeting clearly defined requirements and service levels. Number of formal disputes with suppliers and the percent of supplier invoices that are disputed. And then the activities, percent of major suppliers subject to clearly defined requirements. Percent of a major supplier subject to monitoring. The level of supplier satisfaction, and the number of significant incidents of supplier non-compliance per time period. So it would be per quarter. So, like, to me, those are good metrics. Like, if you can build the process that will account for that stuff. And let me tell you something, as someone who has done audit and has also managed data centers, I feel like that is my superpower. I can go find the testing requirements that tell me what the metrics should be, and then I can go build you a policy, procedure, and standard that'll deliver exactly this. Like exactly this, right? That's what we have to get used to doing. That if the metrics that we're pulling out of this are what's really going to prove we're good at it, then we start to build the process around what the outcome is that we want. So if this is the information we want in the outcome, then that's the kind of process we have to build. And if that's the process we're building, we should be able to pull that together and then have the metrics, the outcomes, and the dashboards that we need in order to pull that off. But for me, this is so far ahead of, I think, where anybody is that I talk to. I don't have this conversation often, Brenda, do you? Because This is one where like this is a 5. This is someone saying, I want to know the percentage of major suppliers that have clearly defined requirements that we put metrics on, and we look at those monthly. That's a huge ask of just the process, let alone I'm going to put metrics around that and then manage that process to those metrics. I don't know anybody who's there yet.
They're starting to. I agree with you that there's not anyone that's actually there, but they're starting to ask, show me this, whiteboard this out for me, tell me where my key performance indicators are to make decisions to tweak my program, show me where my risk indicators are to feed up to enterprise risk. And so the high level things that you have here on this page are completely important. And then when you start digging into the program governance and the risk governance, then it digs down more. I have a couple of slides that we could probably share with you that talk about the 7 steps of the whole entire life cycle. And each of those have at minimum 3 key performance indicators and 3 risk indicators. And that's kind of what people have to start using as their checklist to say, I am finally getting to the point where I'm measuring. And you're right, you cannot manage what you do not measure. That's one of the phrases that if I had a tattoo, I'd have that tattooed on me.
Mine is trust is not a control and luck is not a strategy. I would get that tattooed on me. But you're right? Like I think this to me is the most important stuff. But and you're right. I think there is this lean in toward I want to be this good. Like it is really important. The only people I've ever seen be really good at this, and it's because it's a requirement, is NASA mission. So the people who are at NASA and they're like doing the mission to Mars, whenever they come to you with a risk and you're the one responsible for mitigating it. So it's the landing sequence that you're responsible for mitigating, and they found something in there they want you to take care of. If it cannot be monitored and it doesn't have a metric that's a key performance metric that tells them when it's going bad, you cannot bring it as a solution. Like literally, don't bring it here if you don't have the metrics that go with it, and it can't spit those out in a reasonable way without a huge effort, right? Like so, even when you're working on the mission from Mars, sourcing the monitoring of it is the most important thing. Key performance indicators. If you can't nail those down, you can't bring me this as a mitigation strategy. I say we do what NASA does and just say it doesn't count unless you can monitor it, right? So go away and tell me how you're going to drive that stuff back out. Yeah.
If you can't measure it and you're not telling me why, then why are you looking at it? And that's what we did with key controls. All these questionnaires have like thousands or hundreds of content gathering items. And you get it and you're like, what am I supposed to evaluate now that I have it in front of me? So we hone in on what are the key controls and evaluate those on a quarterly or monthly basis and tweak them based on the threat landscape. But you have to have a target. You can't just look at the whole entire globe. You have to have like an island that's really important.
So you Marie Kondo the security survey, right? I mean, that's what you're saying. Like, we got to clean that up. We're asking ridiculous questions. We should find joy in that. Let's throw away the clutter. Let's throw away the clutter.
Well, it's not clutter to everyone. So it's like, that's kind of going into someone's house and saying, oh, you're a hoarder, and we're going to make you clean it up.
You know what?
We have to be able to give people their...
Anybody listening, I am a hoarder. Come tell me. I'd like to clean it up, right? Like, anyone listening, there needs to be an intervention here. Yeah, no, I get you, because to some people it's important. But I would say that to anybody. Right sizing is nothing but Marie Kondoing the security survey. Right size that for the person you're talking to and the risk that you have. Don't send them stuff on human trafficking if it doesn't matter. Like, that's not part of what you do, then why are you asking me questions about human trafficking when I'm your marketing department? Like it's that kind of crap, right? Like, it's that stuff is what I think can be adjusted. If we go to the next slide, you can see that I also think risk intelligence enhances the process. And third-party intelligence is one thing. You got tons of your own intelligence data inside your own organization. You have your own data feeds. Go find them. Like, everybody's like, oh, I need more data. Dude, you got a ton of data in that data center. What are you doing to find out how it can give context to risk, right? Wonder what the likelihood and impact of distributed denial of service attacks are. It's in the firewall logs. Go find it. Like, I don't understand why we don't have a better handle on this stuff. But understanding the threats that are created by third parties by monitoring the executives and board members, the brands, sanctions, security, corporate social responsibility is becoming more and more important. That's one we pay attention to. Make those threats actionable with real data in real time. If you can go back to your third party and say enough's enough. Kind of like Apple did with Foxconn, when those people were committing suicide at Foxconn and they were leaping from the top of buildings, and Apple's like put an end to it, and Foxconn called them back the next day and like, we put up nets, everything's good. Like that's literally what they did. Like, yeah, we put up some nets, everything's fine. And like Tim Cook was on the next plane to China because that was not fine with him. Had he not done that, who knows what would have happened to the Apple supply chain? Would anybody be standing in line to buy an Apple, whatever it is now, 11 or 12, or I don't even know. I didn't even know the Steelers won yesterday. I'm not helpful. So, but at any rate, but at any rate, like, would you buy one of those if you knew that there was blood on the chip? Of course not. Like, he knew what he was up against and he went and took care of it. So those intelligence feeds are inside your own organization. Don't ignore them. Create audit trails to prove your due diligence. Because let's face it, trust is not a control and luck is not a strategy. I trust you're doing the right thing, but I'm still going to test it. And then easier monitoring and less need for on-site audits and review. Yeah. You don't want audit teams from some other third party crawling all over the place. Just be as transparent as you can, work with your third parties as much as you can. And if you're a third party to somebody, maybe you take the initiative so you can define how this process is going to go. If you're working with someone who hasn't reached out to you, you reach out to them and say, we'd like you to be part of our third party risk management program. We'd like you to sit in on our change management because you're a third party where the change is happening. Like, you can go do that stuff to them. They'll take it. They just won't initiate the process. So if no one's initiated that process with you, you do the due diligence, initiate it with them. You are all part of a third party ecosystem. None of us get out of this. And maybe you're fourth or fifth party. And before you think a fourth party can't take you down, I mean, go look at BP. It wasn't their problem in the Gulf of Mexico. That was a fourth party problem. It was Halliburton and a cement job more than it was Transocean or anyone else. So think about that. That wasn't a third party. That was a fourth party to BP. That spill cost them $250 billion. Not many companies can survive that, right? Like, that's what you're up against, even in your fourth parties. So pay attention to that stuff. This is reduction of risk. It's reduction of production risk. It's reduction of cyber risk. It's reduction of all of that stuff. And the due diligence stuff matters. So anything you want to say, Brenda, about the risk intelligence stuff?
On this one, if it's not actionable, then we shouldn't be doing it. And every CISO I speak to says, if I'm looking at a platform or a tool or a program, if I don't have things that are telling me what action to take, I don't even want to have a conversation. So that's what's most important on this slide.
I feel for them on that one too, because, you know, every notification you're getting, there's some auditor somewhere that expects to see an audit trail for what you did with it. So be careful what you know, or be careful how much data you're putting together. And if you can't put it into a single pane of glass and say, it's going to fix it on itself, or it's going to tell me what to do, you need to hire more people then, because somebody needs to figure out what this thing is saying. And I'm with them. They're up against it in every way, and no one's helping them with this stuff. And, you know, when it happens, when you're finally breached by a third party, everybody's going to look at that CISO and said, what was the process? And if you don't have a good way to say, you guys knew all of this in real time, you might not have a leg to stand on, right? I think that's
make sure your policy states what you're going to be addressing, because I've been in that position before.
You should do a whole webinar about being in that position before. Everybody would want to hear it, I think. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So I think that's really important. We can go to the next slide though. The future for me, we can go to the next slide. It's all automated. Vendor risk management automation. Machine learning and AI will begin to take the manual work out of the third-party risk process. You'll see things in platforms like chat bots for your third parties so they can get through processes quicker if they have questions. Look for more data feeds and more simple analytics. It'll create even more efficiencies and insights. Insights are what we need. I can help everybody type faster by parsing data. Sure, anybody can do that. You know, are you going to be able to do anything with it? That's the question. Linking of the risk silos, technology, finance, and procurement will give better situational awareness. We've all been working on better risk taxonomies to kind of get rid of those silos. I have a pretty good one I think I like, but everybody's been trying it. We just need to find, everybody keeps parading black chickens in front of me saying they're black swans. I know better. You should have found that. Like, there's no excuse. But if you're living in the silos, you're never going to dig this stuff up. Social media feeds will give a holistic view of reputation, brand, and potential impacts from actions related to third parties. It also helps you communicate with your third parties. Don't forget about that. We think there's going to be vendor risk management offices. We think vendor risk management is going to become a thing of its own, right? As as more and more companies are outsourced and more launch straight to the cloud or have cloud first technologies, the more either procurement's going to have to step up and become vendor risk management, or we're going to have to apply somebody to that position, and they're going to need help. So we see the vendor risk management office coming to be, and then more companies will offer complete outsourcing solutions and portals for real-time dashboards. Because if I've learned anything about this market, Brenda, you can tell me if I'm nuts, but if I've learned anything about this market, it's that they have completely different expectations than the risk management market, like the GRC market. Like vendor risk management is like, do everything for me and then tell me yes or no. Like, seriously, that's what they want. They want to be able to say what their tolerance is, but then you go do all that. You come back and tell me yes or no. And then that'll be my first interaction with that third party. I think that's what's really funny, is that they want that level of automation and that level of insight where they don't have that same expectation of the risk management platform alone, which I think is really, really funny, which leads me back to how I look at the market. Like right now, I think the third-party risk management solutions are better than the GRC modules at this point, because they're so geared toward understanding that is a big ask. What you're doing for automation, what you're doing with machine learning and AI in that particular use case, that is a big ask, one that I don't see the platforms inherently taking on, where I see the one-off solutions actually meeting the need. So for me, that's the future. And I think the future lies in the hands of the folks that right now, the future belongs to those single-off solutions that are not part of risk management platforms.
Yeah, and I would agree. It's the engine versus the tracker.
Right.
So if you've got the platform and the dashboards that do all the engine workflow for the third party, and then you've got the GRC system that has additional components from ITIL-based practices, that it segments everything together. So if you look at a platform and you're using it for the engine and you're serving up the risk content into a GRC, you're going to be golden.
Yeah, I agree. And then, and the GRC platforms are good enough at moving that data back and forth that it's really not a problem for them either. So if you're thinking, oh, I don't know. And the other, I think, interesting number is, what was it this time? So 40% of people who have one risk management solution actually have another one somewhere in the organization. So we know that there's more than one, and that people aren't afraid to buy a specific solution for a specific use case need that's big enough, and then feed that data into the enterprise risk management platform. I mean, it's happening everywhere. And third party seems to be the use case that is moving ahead faster than anything else.
Agreed. I would agree.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's go to the next slide. I think this is our last slide where, oh, Brenda, I see brown M&Ms. Let's go trash the dressing room. So going back to David Lee Roth and understanding that this is how simple it should be. I see brown M&Ms, I'm trashing the dressing room, right? I mean, this is what we want all of our risk management programs to be. This is how much we want them to speak to us. This is what we want the dashboard to say. So I'll just say what I say at the end of most of this stuff. Go find your own brown M&Ms, right? It can be key controls. It doesn't need to be 115 of them. It can be 5, right? Like, there are ways to do this where you'll know right off the bat what you're dealing with and how bad it is. I say this to you as someone who spent her career looking at the outcomes of things and then going back and telling you exactly how you got here, because I was your auditor, right? You can, like, I always said I was like a coroner. You could bring me a dead body and be like, oh, I know exactly how they died. You can bring me a process and be like, oh, I know exactly how this came to be. Like, I can just do it. I'll just reverse engineer it back to like, oh, I see what you guys are doing, and here's where I would fix that, right? So it's just your brown M&Ms. You get a chance to refine it. It's on your terms. You're not the promoter. You're the band. Come on now. Got to strut like you own it. That's what I would say about that. Find your own brown M&Ms. Be your own David Lee Roth. What would you say? What would you say, Brenda?
Or your Mariah Carey with the white roses. But I agree. I agree. You've got to find a way that you're going to be able to make it so that it works contextually, automated, identifying what it needs to have to be actionable, and use a platform that can do it all for you.
Exactly. You want to be able to take a look at a dashboard in the morning and say, I don't have anything to worry about in the supply chain. I'll go worry about another dashboard. I think that's an important thing for CISOs to be able to say, right? And especially in the larger conversation where I'm a chief information security officer and I've got to go ask for money. I mean, that's a big ask too. Like, listen, I know we have a whole procurement department, but we need to get better at this. There's a story to tell there. And it's David Lee Roth. Just go tell that story. It gets a lot of mileage. It really does. It's good. But yeah, so this is our last slide. So That's how I want to leave it, you guys. I want to leave you with finding your own M&Ms. Find your own brown M&Ms. Those are your key risk indicators. And don't bring anything to a solution in your third-party environment without those metrics, because it's going to be what you're going to live and die by. That's how you're going to prove you're good at what you do. And you want to prove you're good at what you do. You're David Lee Roth, for God's sake, right?
Thank you so much.
It's been really fun. Oh, sorry, Peter. I was just telling her it's been really fun. I want to go and talk to her about Wizard of Oz now.
Yes, it has been fun, Brenda. Thanks.
You ladies have kept the energy up for a full hour and been very, very entertaining. I appreciate it. Brenda, especially after a long flight to London. So I think if I'm having a bad day, I'm going to call Renee and have a 5-minute conversation. Will cheer me up for sure.
There you go.
So with that, I have just one poll I'm going to launch we do have a number of questions. Many of them were answered during the course of the conversation, but I'll let you answer one question, and then I think we'll have to take everything offline given we've gone over the hour already. But let me read one question while this poll is up. And the polling question is basically asking, would you like a follow-up from a prevalent sales representative to discuss your third-party program? And so answer that honestly, please. I won't be offended if the answer is no. All right, so the questions from the audience here. So the first one that came in, and I think the only one we'll get a chance to address, is what role do cybersecurity ratings play in a third-party security and risk program, and have these services matured enough to be more than a mere data point in the overall risk assessment?
Well, it's interesting that they ask that because a lot of people call it the weather report. It has data that's important, but you have to, like we talked about this whole entire hour, is put thresholds and context to what you're looking at. Some of the information that you're getting in the risk rating reports might be too much intel, so you have to really hone in on the engagement, the relevance of what you're doing with that particular vendor, and then work with them to clean it up, because it's just like a credit score report. When you're going to buy a house, you have the opportunity to go clean it. And so you have to give the vendor the opportunity to clean up their risk scoring report when it's threat monitoring in that aspect. What do you think, Renee?
Yeah, for me, it's still a data point in a larger question. Like I'm trying to get to, especially if you're critical, right? So I might have some risk intelligence stuff on you, but that's not going to be the end of it. I'm still sending you the survey. I'm still going to sit down and talk to you. I'm still going to pick at what I think might be your weaknesses, right? Because this is the only chance I have to do that. And this is a holistic approach, right? Do I think they'll ever get quantitative enough to be able to just say that's the only thing I'm going to look at? I'm going to give that back to you in a question. How would you like to be surveilled 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and then given a score? Because that's where you're saying we should head, right? Like, give me one thing that tells me everything. Well, that comes with an incredible amount of transparency or an incredible amount of surveillance. I'm not so sure we're not headed that way, to be honest with you. Like, I keep thinking, what are the big four going to change in their digital transformation? The only place they can go from audit is to surveillance. So I think we have to think about what we want, think about how much we need to share, and then come up with those questions that are going to tell us the most information, and those we can share freely among ourselves, in platforms that secure our data. I keep reminding everybody, this is security data. I mean, I try to go find out, like, how did the State Department do in its security audit? That stuff you used to be able to find, I can't find it anymore. They're starting to classify that stuff. So you start thinking about that, and you start thinking, like, the more I tell you, the more vulnerable I make myself. Yeah, that's really true. So if that's the case, is the security score ever going to be the last word in what we do? If it is, they know way too much about you.
Well, the other thing is you just brought up a really good point. One of the items for risk that's more important than the risk scoring report is the responsiveness of the third party. That is now being calculated into, if you don't respond to me and tell me how you're doing your security controls, why do I want to work with you?
And there's no easy way to do that. I have CISOs that hired 5 people to do nothing but respond to surveys. Who's getting any value out of that? Those employees aren't getting any value out of that. That CISO is not getting any value out of that. And the people asking the questions clearly aren't getting any value out of that because they got 3 low-level help desk employees filling out this survey. How is that helping, right? So when you're drinking from that fire hose, like you're on the other side of that, you're you. Right, Brenda, you're the third party to an awful lot of customers, and they are doing something very important with you, right? Like you probably come under that certification requirement all the time. So like you need a way to respond to this stuff. You need a way to track this stuff. Everybody is a third party to everybody else. We have to figure this out, or you're going to spend an inordinate amount of time doing something that means absolutely nothing.
Yeah, we have a way to do that. It's called networks, and it's working out pretty well for those who want to standardize. But we've got some people who like proprietary information, so that proprietariness is kind of lagging behind, but we'll get there.
Now that I think, so if I can just end this with this, I would say that to me is more interesting. If you could standardize, we can agree, we can put together a scoring that doesn't reveal too much about you, and you can live with that, almost like FedRAMP, right? Or that kind of stuff, or the NIST cybersecurity framework, where you can say, I comply this much, it's this kind of rating. Like if we could get to that point where it's automated, and you're giving me that information in real time, but I can anonymize it to the point where I can say, you wanted to know about this vendor, this person wanted to know about this person. You're both anonymized, but you accepted each other, and that's when you know who asked and who's responding. Like I think stuff like that matters, but I have to think about, I don't want to create an environment like that thing where we can exchange that. I think that's hugely important. I think we should all try to get there, that exchange thing. I think that's where we all need to be in the end. But for me, and it should all be standardized. Different industries can do different things because they have different regulatory requirements, but that should be kind of where it ends. Server is a server is a server, whether it's on a SCADA network or not. I think that stuff really matters, right? So I think we'll get to standardization one day. I want us to get to standardization one day. I want everybody to go one place to look everybody else up. But when I think about what we have to know about each other just to get to that, that's where, we all have to come to an agreement. Like, how much data am I willing to give you to be able to say that number is the only thing I need to know?
I would talk about this for hours because one of my favorite things is the ability to take what you get and slice it and dice it into the regulatory requirements and frameworks. So you push a button and it says, here's how they apply to NIST, or here's how they apply to ISO, or here's how they apply to FINRA. All these different things are capabilities within the platform, and I'm just hoping that people start to see the value of here's the networks, the exchange, the ability to slice and dice the data and get moving.
Yeah. And that's hugely important, right? Because if you're working with a lot of different kinds of places, they have a lot of different kinds of requirements, and you're just part of that supply chain. And their expectation is, just sent down the line to you. Like I always say, like JP Morgan Chase expects you to be as secure as them. They spend $500 million a year on it. What are you spending? Like, how is that even possible, right? Like, that's what everybody's up against. So those exchanges, I think, are going to be really, really important.
Peter, you're going to have to kick us off the phone because I don't think we're going to ever.
No, a lot of good conversation, but unfortunately we've reached our time. So thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who attended, and I appreciate the conversation. We'll see everybody on the next webinar.
Renee, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Brenda. I had a great time. Thanks.